Remember in chapter 5 when we were talking about the marketing plan, we talked about getting as much data as you can, that data collection. Well, this chapter is all about the external data collection and what it is and what we're looking at and what kind of we're looking for, what this means, how you would perform it, and what kind of information is important. So let's go ahead and start with kind of getting an introduction into that, and we're going to talk about Porter's 5 forces model, which you're going to want to pay attention to for your assignment. So first, what we're doing is something called environmental scanning. So this is when we're taking the opportunities and threats, that OT part of the SWOT analysis, and we're examining the external environment. We want to be proactive, we want to understand what's going on, and we're going to look through something called PEST, which we'll look at in the next video. But first, let's take a look at Porter's 5 forces model. So Porter is a very well-known business theoretical composer, and he has created a number of business strategies that look at competition in the marketplace and what that means. One of his most well-known theories is called the 5 forces model. And so in this 5 forces model, what he's basically saying is that in any industry, you have 5 forces that are constantly bearing down on you. Some forces in some industries are stronger than forces in others, so it's a matter of determining what is impacting you the most and how you strategically manage around these different forces. So in the center of those 5 forces is rivalry among established firms or the existing firms. So what this means is that this is your competition. This is what's going on in the marketplace right now. We're not talking about anyone who could potentially enter. We're not talking about people who have left. We're talking specifically in your marketplace. Who is your current rivalry and how strong is that rivalry? So if we're talking about, let's use Chick-fil-A at the UC. So how much rivalry is there for Chick-fil-A? Well, I've seen a really long line outside the Chick-fil-A, which tells me there's probably not a lot of competition. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because there's a McDonald's right next door, there's an ice cream store. If you go a little bit past that into a different building, you have Jimmy John's and maybe Pink's Pizza. So there is competition, but there's a lot more demand than competition. So the rivalry is probably relatively small. Now compare that to, say, you're going to a mall and there are a lot of different options for fast food. Maybe you have higher rivalry levels. And so that's on a microcosm scale. You can also look at a macro scale, and we're going to talk about that in another video. So make sure you're kind of understanding this idea of how much rivalry is there, or how much competition is there. And so that is one of the potential forces. So on top of that, we have the risk of potential new entrants, which is at the top here. So this is new people who could come into the marketplace. And so we also look at barriers of entry, things that are going to maybe prevent that organization from coming in, or things that are going to help that organization from coming in. In general, we find in the hospitality industry we have relatively low barriers of entry. You don't have to have some great expertise. You don't have to know more than really just opening up a store. So if you want to open up an ice cream shop, how much do you really need to know? It's pretty easy to find that information. Compare that to, say, opening up a space station creation module. You'll have to have a lot of expertise or a lot of capital, a lot of money in order to do that, compared to hotels and restaurants, which are a lot more straightforward. I think most people have this in their mind that, oh, anyone could run a restaurant, anyone could run a hotel. So those barriers to entry are lower. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be successful, but there's a good chance they'll be entering the market. How often do we have new restaurants opening? Do we have new hotels? Do we have new events companies? Do we have new airlines? Do we have new cruise ships, right? So how often are those things happening? And we call that the risk of new entrants based on the barriers of entry. Maybe a barrier of entry has to do with some political thing, such as there are no more liquor licenses. And so we are not going to allow anyone else to open up a restaurant here with a liquor license. That might be a barrier to entry. And so you can see that there might be different things in the marketplace that are preventing new entrants that are not even you as a rival. Then on top of that, we have the threat of substitute products. This is the idea that I could do something completely opposite of what you are and substitute it in. So for example, if I want to go to the movies on a Friday night and I want to go watch a movie, what are my threat of substitutes? Well, I could stay home and watch a movie or watch Netflix. I could read a book. I could go to a bar. I could go out to the park with my kids, right? So anything that's going to use that same time or that same effort. So what I'm looking for is something fun to do on a Friday night. So if my go-to is a movie, my threat of substitute is anything else I could do that would be fun on a Saturday night or Friday night. Okay, a threat of substitute in the industry right now for hotels would be something like Airbnb or vacation rentals. So instead of staying at a formal hotel, I'm staying at people's homes or people's vacation rentals. Threat of substitute for a restaurant might be going to the grocery store, buying ready-to-go foods from the grocery store, or even cooking at home. And so you start to see that there are threats of alternative or substitutes to what you're already doing. And we have to look at whether or not that risk is high or low. In the industry for lodging, for a long time, there has been no real threat of substitute. And so now we're seeing the lodging industry and how they're reacting to this potential threat, which is Airbnb, HomeAway, VRBO, those kinds of things. So really important to look at that as a force. The other two forces go hand in hand. It's the power of the buyers versus the power of the suppliers. What this means is if you have power as a buyer, there is more supply than there is demand. And if there's a power of suppliers, that means that there's more demand than there is supply. So for example, if I am a seller and I have one cookie and everyone in the class wants to buy my one cookie, who has the power? I do as a seller because I have one product with a lot of demand. However, if I am the buyer and all of you are the sellers and every single one of you has a cookie and I want to buy, but I have all these options, I as a buyer now have that power. And so you want to look at the supply and demand, where that comes in, where the supplier and the buyer powers are. You can look at this on a grander scale. So if you're Hilton and you're buying 10,000 mattresses, you probably have a lot of power as a buyer because of economies of scale. And so you can see that just depending on where you are in the marketplace, what's going on, these have different levels of power or force over your ability to succeed. So this is all part of the O&T, and you'll notice on the external part of this five forces model, we have the pest. We have the technological, ecological, economic, political, regulatory, and sociocultural impacts that are coming in and playing a role within the five forces. And so you can see for your assignment that you will want to include not only the five forces, but everything else we talk about within this chapter. So make sure you're watching the other videos, and good luck.